Welcome to my channel. I'm John Peters. I'm a therapist who's been in practice for over 25 years. And this channel is about sharing a variety of tips from a therapist, as well as practical wellness techniques. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts about how the pandemic stress is continuing even into 2023. So if you're feeling that too, you are not alone. Okay, so in this episode, I want to talk a little bit about pandemic stress because this continues to come up in conversations that I'm having with patients. And let me start at the beginning of the pandemic and share a couple thoughts that I have about why it's so stressful and the particular ways that it's stressful. And of course, feel free to leave comments below. Happy to get feedback with comments, and I'll happily make a follow-up video if I get comments that warrant that. But so at the beginning of 2020, I had shifted my practice over to primarily doing telehealth services. So I had closed my regular brick and mortar office and had shifted my practice entirely over to telehealth. So part of what that meant was that I didn't personally have to do a lot of adjusting of the modality of the connection I had with my clients when everything shut down and people started working from home. One of the things that happened with telehealth is that, it was already really expanding quite a bit before the pandemic because the commercial plans had rolled it out as part of normal coverage, and also because the 27 states had passed parity laws that said it was equal to regular in-office visits. So a lot of people were utilizing it. And then Medicare was also very well along in the process of rolling out telehealth for Medicare recipients. So 2020 hit, Medicare lit a fire under themselves and got that done. And so a lot of people had access to telehealth services because they're not working, they're working from home. People want remote services, people are very stressed. So utilization was going through the roof. I was as busy as I wanted to be. And one of the reasons that I think the pandemic was so stressful is that, in normal conditions, when we don't have a pervasive issue like that, stress lands on me and then flows out from me into my environment, especially through my social environment. And one way to conceptualize this is to think about a volleyball net. So if you go up to a volleyball net or a badminton net, you see that you've got all these strings that are crossing, and they're crossing at right angles. So you've got all these little nodes where there's a little knot where each one of those strings crosses. And if you push on one of those little knots, that knot will absorb most of the push, but because they're all connected the way they are, the closest knots to the one you're pushing on will also move. And that's one way to think about how stress often works, that it lands on one of us and then it flows out through all of the connections that exist in our web of social connections. The pandemic was stressful because it was like pushing on the entire net in all places simultaneously, because everybody, literally everywhere, everybody was absorbing more stress, right? Had it been a normal situation where you were more stressed, but everybody in your family was just kind of do going along in their normal lives, whether they're conscious of it or not, everybody around us is always absorbing our stress, right? Now, the good news is everybody around us is always absorbing our positivity to the extent that we're, becoming a beacon of that. But the thing is that everybody got more stressed at the same time. So there were no peaks and troughs in the normal way that there are. And so that means that while my stress didn't have as many places to flow into, meaning out of me, it also meant that I was absorbing more stress from everyone I was connected to. So it was like coming back to me, right? So it was more of a tsunami of stress than a wave of stress washing over any one of us. That's one of the ways I think about why people were more severely stressed during the pandemic. And then, of course, we have the particular stressors. If we zoom in and think about the facets of stress, that people had changes of employment. Um, where my wife has a lot of family that are from a particular region of Thailand that is it's in the south and fairly dependent on tourism. In the south, in Phuket and Phang Nga, the above Phuket, that province, about 80% of the overall economy is dependent on tourism, which shut down 100%, right? So they had 20% of their normal economy going, and the economic stress was severe, right? And that was true there. It was true everywhere, and in the United States as well. So so we had economic stress. We had the fact that our individual stress was landing on us, but not being able to be absorbed out of us in the normal ways that it typically does. And also everyone we were connected to, both like informally, like our family members and neighbors and coworkers and whatnot, that anybody we're connected to. I mean, even for me, um, instantly 100% of my patients were all way more stressed, and I'm connected to everyone that I talk to, right, in a way. And so that stress is coming to me now. Obviously, as a therapist, I need to have a stance toward therapy, and having done this for 25 years, I have fairly well developed ways to cope with the fact that I'm talking with people who are under a lot of stress as part of my job. But the reality is that stress does flow into every social connection, including um, therapy connections, right? So, a mechanism for how people experience stress during the pandemic was social media and technology. And I think that I saw this happening in two ways, one of which was people trying to grasp with the application of technology to adapt to the pandemic restrictions, and this was partly, I would say, this had to do with work and school. So so people had to try to adapt who were trying to work from home. Um, that was not without some stress, right? Now, maybe working from home for a lot of people, it was certainly true that a lot of people found that actually relieving in many ways. But the working from home is not simply a matter of not going into the office. So if you think about the necessary technology and the local office structure that you need, that's important. Also, not everybody may have been tracking this, but another way that people absorb our stress from us is our coworkers. Even though obviously some people work in stressful environments and they're relieved when they don't have to go into an office full of people they have conflicts with or issues with. But when you go into an office every day and you have multiple people that you interact with, those people are part of your social web. So not being able to do that removed that aspect of people absorbing and sharing and collaborating with working out stress. Also, people who are particularly extroverted, were under a lot of stress. I talked to one person who's a real touchy-feely person who hugs people a lot, and the pandemic was wildly stressful for her because her job, she had a very front-facing job where she got to interact with people all day every day, and suddenly she's just sitting at home with her husband, and that shift was tough, and continues to be tough for a lot of people. And then the other thing is school. I think that for kids, sitting at home, is not the same as getting to go to school in lots of ways. I mean, the social aspect alone meant that kids didn't have their interactions with their peers the way that they had. You don't get that through Zoom, right? And then the other thing was and I knew this as an instructor. I taught regular courses at a university for 15 years. I taught 80 full semester courses over a 15-year period. And I did, toward the end of that, do a couple of courses that were remote courses. And teaching remote is not the same animal as just teaching in class and just switching to a computer, right? It, as an instructor, it puts a tremendous burden on you to reinvent the course through that different modality and to try to deliver it while relating to students through that modality. And as students, it's a very different experience. And that's what I learned at the university level and the graduate level. But I'm certain that for instructors in K through 12, that was wildly stressful on them, and it was wildly stressful on the students to try to then academically learn, and then the social aspect was completely whacked. And one of the things that parents have that eases parental stress is the fact that your kids go to school during the day. And suddenly during the pandemic, you had people who were, okay, we're just going to be at home together all day, every day. It's like we're in a capsule together. And that put a lot of tension on parents, because one way to think about it is that the people at school, the teachers, counselors, coaches, staff of all sorts, they're part of a big team that helps nurture and supervise and provide different important roles for kids along with parents. But suddenly, none of those people were actively participating in those ways for parents. Parents had to absorb all of that and be literally in the same house with their kids all day every day. So that was tremendously stressful. And luckily, schools have primarily gotten back to the regular format, which has eased that for a lot of people. But there's also then, in terms of pandemic stress, in technology, the fact that social media platforms, of course, were things that were more available, because some of the normal pressures, like if you're at work, normally your boss might yell at you for being on your phone. If you're sitting at home, the boss isn't going to see that, right? So some of the normal barriers to being able to focus on and get highly involved in like social media platforms and news outlets, things like that, that the barriers went down. Plus, inherently, and I'm going to make another video on social media and stress, but one of the issues with social media is that the social media platforms, like Facebook, for example, they don't have natural limits. So some things in life have natural limits, even if they go on for a long time. Like, for example, I don't like to play the game of Monopoly because to me, it's too long. Um, but it has a natural limit, right? You don't start it and then it goes on for 7 years, right? It will end itself, because the rules of the game causes a dynamic that causes a natural end, right? Same with checkers and Chutes and Ladders or whatever. So Facebook, for example, Twitter, uh, they don't have natural limits. And so what that means is that if you start scrolling, you can scroll and scroll and scroll for hours and hours and hours, right? The platform itself is not going to say, hey, John, you've probably scrolled enough. Why don't you take a break, right? You have to impose a limit on something that doesn't have a natural limit, right? Just like if I go shopping on Amazon, there's no natural limit. Amazon's not going to say you spent enough, stop. But the natural limit there is budget, right? Or, that's too expensive for me, or I don't want to spend any more money. I've spent $100. I don't want to spend 150. So there's that kind of limit that happens. But with social media, there's no natural limit. So part of what I saw is even though that was already a problem before the pandemic, people were engaging with the information that was coming in a way that was causing kind of a desperation and doom scrolling. And that meant that people were just ramping up their anxieties and their negative attitude, because they were getting affirmed in the crisis, right? The data was saying crisis, 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 and more scrolling, more data to say more crisis. So, again, this is not an argument to go stick your head in the sand, and I'm not a Luddite. I think technology can help us in lots of ways. I think that the social connections via the social media platforms are often supportive, but I think it's a mixed bag, and I think it can be part of the issue that takes away our margins that gets us to our tipping point where we get more stressed. And so I had a lot of patients who were spontaneously, without any coaching from me, going ahead and saying, "Look, I'm putting my phone away. I'm stopping scrolling social media because I know that it's stressing me out." And I suggested to a lot of people too to limit it. We also had the riots and things like that, and that was stressing a lot of people out at the same time, and people taking in that information via the social media sources and online sources. So anyway, part of what I saw was the not surprising effect of when people limited social media, their stress level went down. Like I'm thinking of one case, this guy was literally having panic attacks. Why did he contact me? He's having panic attacks. The day after, he decided to limit his phone use in terms of scrolling and looking at the social media information to no more than 20 minutes per day. Because at the time he contacted me, he was doing 2 to 3 hours per day. He limited it to 20 minutes a day. The next day, his panic attacks stopped. Was he still anxious? Yes. But was he having panic attacks? They stopped, right? That one change, right? It wasn't that one session with me, I don't believe. It was that he made that one change to go from 3 hours to 20 minutes of doom scrolling on the social media platform. So I think that was a really significant mechanism for how stress was coming to people. And I don't think the net effect was that it was helping to absorb stress, even though I think it does function that way to some degree, because again, virtual connections are part of how that web of social connections works. But I think more scrolling didn't have a net effect of more absorbing in a good way. I think it had a net effect of more loading in a bad way, in bad ways, plural. So here we are now at the end of 2023. And we don't have as many restrictions. We do have apparently, increasing cases of COVID and flu and RSV and things like that. Pandemic stress continues. And it hasn't, all of those issues that were the severest kind of ways that it landed on us at the beginning of 2020 have not completely evaporated. And even those that have not eased in a way that they're non-issues. And so, for example, I think that part of what happened with the pandemic, because it was so severe, because it was so pervasive, that it precipitated some existential stress. So an example of this, you might have like had this be real for you or seen in the news stories, discussion of people who were reevaluating their careers because they had this dramatic kind of, oh, you're not working, you're laid off, or you're going to work from home, and this is going to be really, really different than before. And this caused people to start to think about choices related to their careers that they hadn't because of that pressure. So would that kind of existential reckoning been available and happening anyway? Yes, because that's part of life. We do deal with our existential issues in our life, but the pressures of the pandemic kind of precipitated a lot more of that. It's like it pushed down on the accelerator for existential issues in some ways. And that continues. So as we're moving into the beginning of 2023, I think part of what's going on with people and part of kind of the tenor of the content and tone of like what I see people talking about lately in my patient population is people still are reckoning with these existential issues. And of course, with the pandemic, dealing with mortality and loss, because the focus on and new awareness of the need for the restrictions for COVID, obviously we're not isolated as the only health issue that exists for people and not the only way that like people we love get sick and die. And so again, that reckoning of mortality also is another way that the pandemic produced stress, but also the way that existential stress is continuing for us today. So I'm personally not a big fan of New Year's resolutions because I think that, a commitment to positive change should happen now, whether now is, December 31st or, July 7th or whatever. But, it is an occasion to think about the turning of the year and, what's been happening and what's up now and what do we anticipate moving into the future, which is why I decided to make this video. Also, because some of my patients just brought it up too. It's like, here we are still in the pandemic. So, the pandemic took away some of our margins. It put us all more closer to certain thresholds and tipping points to have kind of more challenging and severe kind of manifestations of stress. It made it even more important to take care of ourselves. And this again is part of why I want to have this channel, is to offer tips that you can learn and incorporate into your life that help you be less stressed and function better, be more, have more positive mood and get along better. um, and we're doing this in a real context, right? We still have the pandemic, we've got the economic issues that are going on, we've got the war in Ukraine and a host of other issues, right? Lots of structural issues that exist in society that were there before the pandemic, which have not resolved yet. So stay tuned for the channel. I do talk about practical issues that are good for everybody in lots of ways. But, I am a person, and I'll talk about this more in upcoming videos. I do think politics matter. I think society matters. I think community matters. I think our social connections matter. And, psychology needs to continue to consider those. And so part of what I'll talk about are ways that we can work with all of the domains. And if you watched the video I made recently on the pies check-in, I promote a holistic paradigm where we do have broad and sufficiently deep awareness of all the domains of our lives so that we can work with ourselves and all the ways we need to be the way we want to be, right? And to not be miserable and to be satisfied with ourselves. So anyway, stay tuned with the channel. I will have more stuff coming up, but I thought I'd just make these comments here because we're getting near the end of the year. So feel free to leave comments below. Feel very free to hit the like button. I'm happy to have you here at the channel. Feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in an upcoming video.